Well, rules is rules. Let's get started.
Another race for the world's greatest driver, Juan Manuel Fangio.
Former world champion Jim Clark leapt into the lead. That's Clark's Lotus going like a bomb.
And James Hunt is the world champion by just one single point.
By being a racing driver, you are under risk all the time. And if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver.
And that is Michael Schumacher ahead, the world champion.
To become a four-time world champion, Sebastian Vettel, Lewis Hamilton, champion of the world.
That's for all the kids out there who dream the impossible.
Max Verstappen is champion of the world.
Oh my God! Max Verstappen, you are the world champion! The world champion!
Hello and welcome to episode 18 of F1 in Review 2023. I'm Tom Clabon and I'm joined by Tristan Fancourt. Today we look back at the Canadian Grand Prix, part 1 at least, and we start off not with a driver, not with a team, not with Verstappen winning yet another Grand Prix, but with a topic. This one being, what is an unsafe release? Now, Tristan, if I were to try and add a definition to the Oxford Dictionary, for example, I'd try something like this. A team's decision to signal for a driver to rejoin the pit lane in a manner that could likely inhibit another's race temporarily or permanently. That being an unsafe release. How's that? Would you change anything or pretty pitch perfect?
That's pretty good. Is that written by the FIA or is that your own original work?
That is from me, by my
That's
own
very
hand.
good. I like that one. Just repeat that last bit again.
Which would likely inhibit another's race temporarily or permanently.
See, that's a very good definition of what I think we all colloquially accept to be an unsafe release, i.e. that someone jumps out ahead of you and you have to hit the brakes and stop, and therefore, as a result of that, you have had a disadvantage applied to you, which probably carry throughout the rest of the race. If it's Monaco, definitely. And actually, that's what makes Monaco particularly fun. Now, of course, this wasn't Monaco. This was Canada. But it wasn't one of those situations where I think we had a number of unsafe releases. That means that this is a topic worth discussing, right?
Yeah.
Now, Tom, do you think that the unsafe release should be maybe like an interpretation by the FIA and the stewards at the time, i.e. they look at the situation by situation, or do you think there's some sort of fixed line that we could perhaps employ so that maybe a car is coming up the pit lane and there is in the pit box of the car it wants to try and overtake, right? If you the car that comes up the pit lane and gets within, let's say, 15, 20 centimeters from the rear of the A pit lane, the car that's in that pit box isn't allowed to release.
Gee, now that is a difficult one because I think, as with my definition really, and we saw this weekend particularly with Alonso versus Hamilton, for example, and I believe a McLaren of Lando Norris versus Tsunoda, correct me if I'm wrong, we saw two examples where I said in our group chat, well, hang on, that's got to be an unsafe release. There has to be a penalty. The FIA said no. I think you, Tristan, from memory, were equally sort of ambivalent about the need to go and thrash them with a penalty. So I think there needs to be some subjectivity to it, but I think something where you were talking about there about the fact where if you're so many seconds or indeed part of a second close to another car or centimetres close to another, there has to be perhaps some guidelines or some, I suppose, broad brush vagary in terms of there to make sure that there is some manner in which we can define a release to be safe or unsafe, really, because I was a bit surprised how that was deemed as a safe release, that being the Hamilton release versus Alonso, because I totally understand the desire to jump somebody else in the pit lane. I mean, that is not a new phenomenon, that is not something I want to stamp out necessarily, but I don't know if it was Alonso putting his brakes on and like Toto Wolff sort of mimics in the garage.
Yeah,
mocked him for his sort of bizarre or extravagant, should I say, driving of the car in terms of his hands on the steering wheel. But I thought that was unsafe. So I suppose to answer your question in short, if another's tyres is damaged, be that from a lock-up or something like that, be it a touching of a nose cone to the rear of a car or the proximity or closeness from one to another. That may be the way to take some subjectivity away from it and to make it more black and white. But I think there's always going to be some interpretation as part of it.
Oh yes, and I certainly think that Alonso's dramatic and vigorous steering wheel wiggle would offer him a chance at, well, an Oscar this year with some of the finest acting I've seen. And it was a little bit over the top, wasn't it? And he was a bit of a drama queen hitting his brakes. And it was definitely 50-50. But I think that's what I was thinking at the time. I was like, well, this could go either way. Now, I was a bit concerned because throughout the weekend, the stewards at the Canadian Grand Prix were handing out penalties quite readily, let's say, and certainly after qualifying, there were a lot of move rounds, and it really impacted people like Nico Hülkenberg, who lost out on second place because broke the rules. Now that led me to believe that we were going to see a penalty applied to Hamilton, and of course that never happened. Alonso ended up getting past, so it didn't really have a long-term impact. But I apologise for my poor description of what I'm thinking for like an automated system, but I'm sure there is an automated system that we could employ that would at the very least prevent some of these issues and maybe the more major issues from occurring. And basically, when you look at the pit lane, every team is given a pit box. You're only given one, which is why some teams this weekend had to double stack, some more successfully than others. And that pit box is a clear and defined marking, right? And if you imagine looking at the pit lane, you enter from the left-hand side for argument's sake, and you exit on the right-hand side, and it's a nice straight. Well, then you have these segments within that which you would expect people to pit into, these boxes. Now, let's imagine in the case of Alonso and Hamilton, right? They come in together and they both go into their respective pit boxes. Mm-hmm. Now, Alonso's pit stops quicker, which means he exits his pit box and starts approaching Hamilton's pit box whilst Hamilton's still in it.
Yeah.
If Alonso reaches the side of the pit box of another team that's closest to the pit exit, right? Let's say, and so if that makes sense, that keeps it fixed each time. If he gets within, should we say, a meter of the outer edge, the edge that's closest to the pit exit of your pit box, the car that's in that pit box is unable to be released. So an automatic red light would go up, and then the car will be forced to wait to go through. And that, I think, would solve a lot of the issues. Now, you may say, well, that's all well and good when the pit boxes are far apart, but what do you do about the pit boxes that are really close together? And actually, what I would say is, if you are challenging the person next to you in the pit lane, then it's pretty logical to me that we keep it fixed and it'd be pretty fair. You'd still have to jump them on time, and I'm only saying I think it would be a very close point. I'm not saying it should be a meter, maybe half a meter, maybe even just 30 centimeters away, but the point is currently teams are able to release the cars even when a car is alongside another car. Now, many of them would wait out of respect, but often and sometimes they haven't before. So I think at the very least we could have some sort of automatic point in which the red light will be unable to go on. And the other argument against it is, well, what happens in a case of rain when every car is trying to get past? How on earth would you ever release anyone then? And at the moment, no one can release anyone ever sometimes either. That just happens. It's well known that if it's an occasion where everyone runs into the pits at the same time, you get these massive losers and these massive winners. And what I'd say is the teams would have to wait for that moment in which it goes green. And actually, what that would do is it would give you a fail-safe point as well, where if it's green, at the very least you had X amount of distance between the car behind you, which may help a little bit, especially for the drivers that, often they say, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to be released. They just told me to go. Well, you know that if it's green, at the very least, there's not a car 30 centimetres behind your pit, the outer edge of your pit lane, or some sort of detection zone.
I think that's very fair, really, and I think it's quite fortunate we haven't seen more crashes or more incidents that actually result in material damage in the pit lane over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, really. It's been down to instinct and driver skill, and you're right there, it gets to a point where, yes, you want to go and make sure that teams aren't losing hand over fist unnecessarily, but then also safety has to become a part of this, because let's say, for example, that there is a crash in the pit lane, that would result in a red flag of some sort, and then where do the cars go? Because not all of them can go into the pit lane, for example. You're essentially creating a bottleneck and then delaying, cutting back from Grand Prix action to a severe point, I'd say, really. So it's definitely one of these ones where the Canadian Grand Prix raised some eyebrows and raised some issues, really, about these things moving forwards, because dramatic or not, there were some more close incidents than not close incidents, if you will, from driver to driver, and on this occasion we were fortunate, but on other occasions it could result in a headache where people go, well, blimey, why didn't the FIA do something about this, or have X procedure or protocol to go and deal with Y? So why not nip it in the bud from the early doors, I reckon?
Yeah, absolutely. It's pit lanes and pit stops, especially nowadays, have had even more of an emphasis applied to them. Because we don't have the crazy times of refueling, and when pit stops used to be quite a common thing throughout the race, and used to get quite a multitude of strategies. If you remember, we used to have those like super long runners who would fuel up the car quite heavily and be on quite hard tires, and then those who were going for outright pace by not fueling very much and being on the well, at the time the faster of the two tires, because that's how it used to be, folks. We used to have your normal, your prime tire, and then like your option tire, and so which is confusing. And so you used to have these different strategies, and that led to loads of different problems, actually, including cheating at one point. I think by Renault. So now we have such an emphasis on that, I don't know, one moment or two moments maybe in a race where the teams decide to pit and become vulnerable, that this issue, I think, is going to get more and more exacerbated as we go along, because when it isn't only expected to be a one-stop pit, a one-stop race, then teams will basically do anything they can and release at any time. And you know, unfortunately, I think also the thing about the pit stop problem is unless you actually get hit, I think often the FIA will sort of leave it, and I think that's a better way round to have it. If you're going to have it a way round, I guess you can be pretty consistent with that. But to be fair, it's not a great system, and every time this happens, I'd sort of wince, because as you say, when an accident happens in the pit lane, it throws up loads of issues, because then you're unable to bring the cars in very easily if there's a major problem.
Exactly. You can't have the cars return to the scene of the crime, if you will. So it's one of those where we're relying on goodwill and good conscience and good driving ability without having, well, from what we know publicly, a system in place. So it's one of those where it's fine until it doesn't work. But dare I say, there's going to be one or two occasions, particularly in Monaco, for example, particularly where there's only one stop needed and it's so vital between two cars and two constructors who are doing so well, that you're going to go and have a problem which will, result in people going, why wasn't more done? But it's something we're not having to speak about in terms of a physical crash this weekend, so that's a good thing, and some will say we're being melodramatic, but here we are. I suppose one thing we're going to go on and speak about from this, it's linked to a pit stop, kind of, to an extent. This is Lando Norris getting a 5-second penalty for, quote, unsportsmanlike behaviour this Sunday. Now, this saw him fall from P11 to P13, and this is because he was trying to make sure that pit stop that he got and his teammate Oscar Piastri got was helped by the fact the safety car was in action, that the pack behind him in that safety car train was so far back, and he created that gap artificially that a double stack could be done successfully. Now, this is pretty unprecedented. It scuppered Lando Norris's chances of a point or points plus. Did the FIA get this one right, do you reckon?
Well, it's a pretty... it's one of those things where this happened quite a lot, and many drivers have been at fault for this sort of behaviour, and I think it'll be pretty clear cut to the FIA. Now, they have all the onboards, they have the telemetry, and they'll be able to see the speeds throughout and whether or not you're keeping consistent pace or whether or not you're lifting and your average speeds. And they would have looked at this and seen that it was going to be a double stack. They would have seen that Norris lifted off and just brought that speed right back. And look, he held up other cars. And Tom, if you apply the end of your definition for the unsafe pit release to this, then I think it becomes quite clear. I mean, it had a long and lasting effect on another team. And so, therefore, it's worthy of a penalty. I think they've got to crack down on it, because it kind of frustrates me when you watch a team be saying, in their heads, they're like, right, that's it, we're going to double stack, we'll do the brave thing, we'll double stack. And what we mean by double stacking is when, a car goes in and then its teammate behind is going to enter the pit lanes as well. So one car leaves as the other one enters. And it's an incredibly interesting orchestration, really, of tyre changing. I mean, imagine if your local garage could change tyres that quickly. It'd be amazing, wouldn't it? Wow. But I think that if you're going to be brave in double stack, and then you realise you've kind of ballsed it up a bit because we're a bit too close, then that's it. You should just have to stop. Lando Norris should have had to have stopped and waited. And we've seen Ferrari have to do that before, where they've got it wrong. We've seen Mercedes do that before when they've got it wrong. I think in this occasion they got it right. I think the FIA got it right. McLaren decided to be brave, to be bold. They didn't get the timings right, and so Norris tried to compensate for that. And I just, at the expense of everyone else, and I just don't think that was particularly appropriate.
It certainly raised my eyebrows plural when it was given out, or the definition of said penalty there. I'm conflicted about this because I totally understand the fact that it is, broadly speaking, unsportsmanlike insofar as you're trying to artificially gain an advantage in a environment where the race should be neutralised and there shouldn't be any tactical strategy being deployed. But there we are. But then again, I respect it to a point because it's quite canny. And it is strategic, and it is, going back to last episode, McLaren utilising advantages and surprises and opportunities when they come about, knowing that when it comes to raw pace, for example, when it comes to the racing environment, they can't necessarily gain an advantage in the most traditional sense. They have to go and rely on artificial events within the race, i.e. safety cars, virtual safety cars, or indeed events in qualifying, be it the raw pace there and the window they have. So I think the penalty that was given to Lando at the time was harsh. I'd have given a financial penalty, however, to McLaren for orchestrating this, because I'm not convinced that Lando Norris himself is purely culpable for this. I'd say this is more a team issue. So therefore, I'd say something like a financial penalty and maybe 1 or 2 points on the super licence for unsportsmanlike behaviour would be better than a 5-second penalty. But then again, that may be me being quite, dare I say, quote-unquote soft, because he was so close to the points, and I fancy McLaren getting a few points, really, because it's been such a rough ride for them, but there we are.
That's been a rough ride, but I think the nice thing about the 5-second penalty, though, is it does wrap up the issue there and then. It gets applied and it doesn't carry over. And do you think it should carry over? Because the points, for example, on the super license would carry over throughout the season and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I mean, if they're defining it as unsportsmanlike, then therefore, dare I say, attacking someone's nature and character to a point, aren't they? So how can someone be unsportsmanlike in one race and then be clean-cut Jim, whiter than white the next race? You see what I mean? Like, it doesn't make sense to me how you can deem someone to be unsportsmanlike in their nature, then almost be like, well, they're not actually unsportsmanlike, that was just a crack in their armour, if you will. So it's given to various drivers, famously. I think it's Pierre Gasly got so many last season. There was a question about whether he or other drivers would exceed the limit. Sebastian Vettel as well, rejoining the track spectacularly in that Monza race. There was an issue there about whether he would be banned. Tsunoda as well has fallen victim. So I don't know, it seems a bit of a juxtaposition, a contradiction in one way, to give, on the one hand, penalty points to some drivers for unsportsmanlike behaviour, then on the other hand go, well, we'll just give you a 5-second penalty and then you'll have learnt your lesson and you'll come back a better character next race. See what I mean?
I get your point, but I think I like the fact that it was wrapped up there and then, and I, it was a shame that it meant that Lando lost the points positions, and even though he was fighting incredibly hard, he was never going to escape the fact that he was too close to all the cars around him, thanks to, in part by Alex Albon's ability to hold everyone back and hold everyone up behind. But it doesn't take away from the fact that it was Lando Norris who lifted off and pushed everyone back. And he made that decision to do that. And as a result, it impeded everyone else in the same way that with an unsafe release, you'd often expect to see the driver being penalised. I think my issue is they called it unsportsmanlike behaviour. I think I agree with Ted Kravitz. I think at the time he said that it was a bit of a bizarre ruling, and I agree. I think they should have been clearer. They should have just said 5-second penalty for driving unnecessarily slowly in the pit lane. I think that's what has been previously ruled. I'm not totally sure whether they're coming up with unsportsmanlike behaviour. I accept that it is a bit unsportsmanlike, but I wouldn't say it's like whacking into another car on purpose or doing something equally aggressive. I mean, I think unsportsmanlike is quite a difficult thing to do in Formula One. My examples that come to my head is things like Mazepin's excessive weaving on the straights, for example, would be unsportsmanlike behaviour. I believe Max Verstappen in his early days of his career was pretty unsporting in the way he, and actually even you might even say into the 2021 season when he was overly aggressive and pushing people off the track, right? That's unsportsmanlike, pushing people off the track. I don't say this is unsportsmanlike. I would say it's just driving unnecessarily slowly in the pit lane. It falls into the category of light slaps on the wrist to me, I think. But importantly, I think I don't know, Tom, I'm more in favour, I think, of things being sorted out then and there on the track and then moving on from it. It does mean that if something else happens throughout the year, Lando won't be penalised unnecessarily now, which will have consequences then. This was just a pretty light touch issue and needed a light touch response. A 5-second penalty is the bare minimum penalty that the stewards can give in terms of time. So yeah, it was. I think that was pretty fitting to me.
And then going from one driver who had an unlucky, some would say unfair, but a no points finish to a driver who did. This being Alex Albon at Williams, qualified P9 up to P7, and this comes after a rather dismal P20 and a P16 for Williams. In Spain, you had Logan Sargent as well DNFing once again. They're 9th in the Constructors, 7 points to their name. And it's quite funny, if I read back some of my notes I prepared for last week's episode, we didn't get onto the topic of Williams at all really, but it's quite damning. But now, dare I say, my notes have changed somewhat to a rather more upbeat setting really, and that's owing to one driver in particular. How good was Alex Albon this weekend?
Alex Albon was brilliant, wasn't he? Wasn't he brilliant? I think qualifying, he was exceptional. Absolutely. And Alex Albon deserved to get driver of the day. Sometimes I look at the drivers of the day and I think, I'm not sure I agree with that. I wholeheartedly, completely and utterly agreed. It was a weekend full of surprises, I think, actually. And Williams knocked it out of the park. I really do think they knocked it out of the park. Should we start with qualifying? Because I think that was a really interesting situation for Williams.
Let's do it, yeah.
It was an unpredictable qualifying in terms of the weather. If you didn't catch it, there was a build-up towards rain, and it started raining in a meaningful way in Q2. And there was a lull in the weather, and Alex / Williams is a bit unclear about who made the final call, but certainly Alex said, I think it's time for dry tyres, and did it earlier than anyone else. And he was able to fit the dry tyres into a window of performance that was fleeting, and I think probably 2 laps, because Williams and Alex Albon got 2 exceptional laps in Q2. And I think on the second lap, everyone else went, oh my God, it's fast. Quick, go in. Everyone else went onto the tyres and no one could match the pace. It was the closest anyone got was Verstappen, and he was 3/10 off, which I think tells you about how fast Alex Albon was. He managed to get those tyres hot because bear in mind, Tom, the other thing that the teams didn't have going for them this weekend is the cooler tyre blankets that we've got means that the tyres switch off, a little bit quicker than they used to. But Alex managed to do a couple of warm-up laps on them, get a flyer lap in, and then get a super flying lap in to top the charts at Q2. Wasn't it nice to see them topping the charts at a qualifying? Just seeing them at the top for once.
Yeah, it was incredible. It was like when Alonso was in the McLaren and was able to get P1, albeit briefly, and I think the second round of qualifying at Silverstone, for example. It was harking back to the glory days, which Williams would love to do so dearly. It took me back to sort of 2014, 15, 16, when it was Felipe Massa and Valtteri Bottas there, where they actually could get up to P2, P3, even challenge Mercedes once or twice for P1 there. So I think it shows that with Alex Albon, although he's in a car which is one of the worst on the grid, I think that's fair to say, he is able to go and bring that car up, kicking and screaming sometimes, utilising the circumstances, the environment, the weather to his advantage at times as well. Couple that with, let's be honest, some good strategic thinking from James Vowles and co, and it shows reasons really for Williams to be optimistic. I suppose with many a topic in Formula 1, isolated incidents are one thing, making it a trend is something else entirely, but at least it shows they've got the tools and they've got a game plan, if you will, to go and make sure that they're able to utilise what they have. And not only did they do that in qualifying in terms of getting into the final stages of that, being in the top 10, as Haas did, but they went one further as well and got that points finish, and that really is the difference, isn't it? Not to go and single out Nico Hülkenberg again, but to qualify well is one thing, to keep it there in the race is another. So I think Albon's proved why Williams fought so hard to get him out of that Red Bull Academy and into the Williams-Mercedes sphere of influence, if you will, and in my mind, I think he's their way out of finishing in P9, P10, and actually getting up and fighting with the Hasses and co. That may be unfair on Logan Sargent because this is his first season. DNF in this race, was last, I believe, in Spain as well. But Albon showing why Red Bull showed so much faith in him in seasons prior. But as with Red Bull and his time there, it's time to now kick on and make that consistent, albeit that quite a difficult task to do when you've got, if we're being honest, not a brilliant car.
No, absolutely. And what kind of frustrates me so much is I still think that there should be points for consistency. And looking at the points, it's really sad, and it annoys me so much. It annoys me so much that people like AlphaTauri are only on 2 points, Williams only on 7 points, Haas 8 points, Alfa Romeo 9 points, because I think it should be there should be a consistency element to it. And I know, for example, this weekend it wouldn't have really worked out in Williams' favour because as Logan Sargent had to retire. But my point is okay, Logan might not necessarily set the world on fire just yet when it comes to overall performance. That doesn't mean he shouldn't get rewarded for the consistency that is there. And as a result, I think Williams and the other teams lower down in the divisions could certainly play the consistency card. And you're saying, well, you could be in 11th and 12th the whole season and finish 10th. Mm-hmm. I ask you, Tom, would that make them the worst drivers? Would that make them the worst team? No, I don't think it would.
No, it wouldn't.
No, so I'm just going to pre-answer you there. I just don't think it would. I think that's incredibly unfair. If you finish in 11th and 12th place every race in the season, I would say that you are 50% plus a little bit right from the top team, which means you should be in 6th, not plumb last. And that always bugs me. Now, James Vowles was talking about the performance increase, and actually, if you haven't watched his YouTube stuff, I would highly recommend it. Williams have started doing a Vowles breakdown of the weekend, and he's talking about how Williams, they're expecting the performance to increase just a little bit, and 3, maybe 4 years until we see them in a properly competitive place. Now, I think, Tom, you talk about green shoots a lot. I think Williams currently do actually have the green shoots behind them. There's been a lot of changes there. James was very, very very tactful when he said that there were things that when he joined the Williams weren't doing very well, and some things they were, but some things they weren't. And I feel like he's brought his knowledge from Mercedes and is allowing the team to progress forward. I think once and if they get Logan Sargent up to the same sort of position as Alex Albon, I think they could be challenging for 7th place. They're only 2 points behind. And if you think that's a little bit out there and maybe I'm dreaming too much, it's worth noting that at the moment Williams has 7 points. In the whole of last season, they only ever managed to score 8 points. So, yes, they're in 9th, but they're not in 10th. And they're getting more points than they were before. So I think it steps in the right direction. And it was, as I say, the top Q2 and got into Q3. Unfortunately, due to the rest of the rain, Williams wasn't very lucky. Alex never actually managed to set a proper time, which was a bit of a shame. But he started P10, and then in the race, wow, master defender, would you say, this weekend?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, the fact he was able to hold back a Ferrari for large portions of the race is testament to the driver, more so than the car, I reckon, there, because say what you will about Ferrari, and we may get onto them later in this episode, the car they have this season is nowhere near as fast as it was last season. And when you're comparing how poorly Williams have done this season compared to how well Ferrari have done at the respective ends of the table, you've got to go and say congratulations to Alex Albon and to the team there, because yes, with Canada, there are some areas of it. There's corners and the like, sectors that are dominated by tight corners, slow to medium pace. There's also half the circuit, give or take, which is basically a flat-out straight. So it's not like they could depend on their expertise in one areas or how good they were in one areas and this ultimately paper over the cracks about how poor they were in other areas. I think that this circuit showed that on their day, Alex Albon and Williams by extension can actually cause a few problems for other teams higher up and can ruffle a few feathers. As you say, they're very much in the fight for 7th place at the moment. They're behind Haas and Alfa Romeo, who in my mind have missed many opportunities, who have perhaps had their peak weekends when it comes to performances. And if Williams are able to kick on here and utilise this moving forwards, I don't see any reason why your prediction of 7th place for Williams in the championship can't become closer to a reality, really. So, as I say, Albon doing a fantastic job there. There's no doubt the pressure would have been on him personally, in terms of not only from Williams, in terms of, well, we really do need to get these points, not overtly perhaps, but subconsciously thinking this is a great chance, we can't afford to miss this. But Albon himself must have been feeling some pressure. Rarely gets the chances to be in such a position. I think it's fair to say the environment and the weather helped him get up to where he was, as you said earlier, Tristan, so eloquently. So it was a chance he had to execute. And as we say, you're not able to go and get points on consistency. It's about picking off those opportunities and really, I suppose, twisting the knife into your opponents. He's done that again. Got a record of doing that, it's fair to say, with this Williams car. Whisper it quietly, but maybe even an 8th place could be something they move into relatively shortly. What do you think?
I do think. And let's just take a moment as well to reflect on Williams' success this weekend. I want to apply just a small correction to what I said about where they started. Alex Albon qualified in 10th, but because Ferrari being Ferrari and Carlos Sainz being unable to keep his position, he got a penalty. So Carlos Sainz moved backwards to 11th and everyone slotted up a place. So Alex Albon started in 9th position and ended in 7th. When was the last time we were able to say that Williams started in the points and moved up the points? And just to sandwich him for a moment, let's check out where he was sandwiched between Sergio Perez in 6th and Esteban Ocon in 8th. A Williams behind the Red Bull and in front of the Alpine. That's crazy. That's not what we expect. And actually, Alex was fantastic. He just knew where to position the car. They managed to get the strategy just right, and that's James Vowles' influence to the team. But also for a person that everyone was writing off in Red Bull, it's nice to see Alex Albon pushing forward and continuing to make great strides. And yes, okay, he got 6 points, and that's 98% of all the points that Williams have had this year. There's 6 out of their current 7 points. But another performance like that, they would be easily having enough to overtake for, so should we say 8th place? I mean, I do expect Haas to collect more points as we go forward, but they could certainly jump their rivals and certainly end up in 8th place.
Oh, definitely. Unfortunately, between 2018 and 2022, they've largely been at the foot of the table, haven't they, really? Doing some research, they've finished last in all but one Constructors' Championship between that time. So what's that? 4 years of 10th and then occasional upwards trajectory of that. I think, yeah, there really does need to be some more money put in, I think, from Dorilton Capital to a point, better recruitment to build on the acquisition of James Vowles and also Alex Albon as well. But as I say about other teams, green shoots for sure, and looking forward to somewhere like Silverstone, for example, particularly, but to a lesser point, Austria as well. These are circuits that aren't a million miles away from Montreal and the Canadian Grand Prix, so if the situation is correct and they can get themselves into an opportunity where they can execute points and execute an opportunity, who's to say they couldn't do something like this again in those two races, or at least one of them, or indeed in races moving forward. So I was so ready last weekend to go and really twist the knife into Williams and go, what on earth are they doing? They're showing no ambition, they're going absolutely nowhere. But here they are, showing a chance, showing an opportunity to prove me wrong, and I hope they do that moving forward for sure. And last but not least, on a similar positive note, although a different topic, a different theme about it, Ferrari. Ferrari played a strategic blinder. Do not adjust your headsets, your earphones, anything at all. You heard me correctly. Ferrari played a strategic blinder. Not too sure if it is intentional or not. And while most pitted under the safety car, the drivers of Leclerc and Carlos Sainz didn't do that. They finished in P4 and P5 because of the safety car and the other people pitting. They chose not to do so. They decided only to pit once in this Grand Prix, while others pitted too. The graining was so poor that others were perhaps forced into doing so, while Ferrari decided not to do so. It's a gamble. It's one that paid off in a rather spectacular fashion. Our thoughts on this? Could this be something to show that Ferrari are actually listening and learning from their mistakes?
Oh, this is the great debate now, isn't it, Tom? Was it blind luck or a strategic genius from those on the wall? And how we laughed as well. How I laughed on lap 6. Oh, look at Ferrari not pitting.
Silly.
Oh, silly old Ferrari. Here we go again. Here we go. Oh, I'll never know. I know. I'm half expecting, right, that to actually it emerged that the reason they didn't pit was because all the Ferrari strategists were too busy, doing something else, looking the wrong way, and oops, oh no, it's gone past us. Oh well, I guess we won't pit them. It was an odd one, wasn't it? Because Logan Sargent had got to lap 6 and then car had to be retired, and that was very early into the race. Very, very early indeed. And far too early out of the 70 laps, really, to pit for the one-stop strategy. All the teams, apart from them, really came in and decided to pit. Now, for teams like Red Bull, it was a pretty clear and obvious decision because they had the outright pace. They knew they could basically just make it up again. For Ferrari, I think they were in an odd position because they were so far back from everyone else and where they wanted to be, having, as we explored earlier, people like Carlos Sainz having to start in 11th place because of penalties. I have a funny feeling they looked at themselves and thought, look, we're either going to finish 10th and 11th and get one car in the points here, or we're going to pit. We're not going to pit now, take the gamble that someone else is going to crash later on, be in an advantage and get both cars into the points. Now, I think that's the strategy they played. I think what ended up happening was a bit of a surprise to even Ferrari. As you say, Tom, the tyres wouldn't last as long as they wanted to. Everyone else pitted basically to the hards and said, right, now it's only 65 laps. Off we go. Hope the hards last. That was their strategy. Everyone else's strategy. They've done their cheap pit stop because of the safety car. And unfortunately, it wasn't going to work out like that. The graining was too high. Everyone was going through their tyres too quickly. And even though, when you look at it, other cars behind him. So, for example, Esteban Ocon, Lance Stroll, those sort of drivers, and Sergio Perez as well. Even though they were on the newer tyres, they couldn't really get the performance increase that they were expecting on the new tyres for long enough to re-jump the drivers of the Ferraris. And so everyone else had to pit again. And as soon as that happened, then Ferrari completed the race with one pit stop less, and that was it. It was one of those moments of magic. And I just can't believe I'm going to say this, Tom, but best strategic decision of the race goes to Ferrari.
I know. And I don't think I'll ever tire of hearing or saying that, really, because maybe it does show that after so many years, a decade plus of not winning anything, they go, oh, hang on that. Maybe we should do things differently. But it was genius. I think that if I were to surmise it, they stumbled into genius. They stumbled into a fantastic finish. But a fantastic finish it was nonetheless. I could see the merits of it to a point, i.e. one driver not pitting and getting themselves bumped up from, let's say, I don't know, P8 to P4 or P10 to P5 as was. But I thought, like any other team, they'd split it, follow the pack in one direction, but then have a gamble or an experiment really with the other, because let's be fair, it was a poor qualifying once again, owing to one reason or another. They weren't expecting too much, but the gamble paid off really. But it remains to be seen whether it was a fluke or not a fluke, really. Of course, if I were to go and speak to Fred Vasseur, he'd say, oh, of course. Oh, we know exactly what we were doing. This is the new Ferrari way. But I think in reality it was something a bit more of stumbling into success, as I say. So well done to them. I think they've done a very good job there in securing some points and executing an opportunity there. But I'm not too sure it was strategic. I think it was more a hope, and a hope that worked very well, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't remember Canada being a circuit where degradation, graining, for example, has historically been bad, regardless of the many tight corners in the fair sort of one or two sectors. It's not one where I immediately think, blimey, two-stop race. So for that reason, I don't think they were perhaps thinking, well, everyone will have to pit twice and will be really clever. But they've profiteered, haven't they? What do you think?
Well, I mean, if you look at the previous Canadian Grand Prix, then you'll see that actually Canada tends to be relatively light on wear, and you can definitely get away with only a one-stop race. And that's what everyone was expecting to do this weekend. Unfortunately, I think it was just a bit too far back, and the timings weren't great, because as I say, it was very early in the race, and it was also a very green track as well. The heavy rain meant that all the rubber had been removed last from the race before it, and all the it was a very odd situation where you just had this, as a result, high graining and quick destruction of the tyres. Do you think, though, that actually Ferrari bumbling into this moment of magic could be a symptom of their old ways and not necessarily of a new and revitalised, rejuvenised strategic team within Ferrari? And the reason I suggest this is because Ferrari have played this before, and they've decided that they want to risk it for another pit stop before, and it hasn't worked out. And actually, and this is just one thought I had, by not following the trends of the successful teams in terms of strategic direction, like Mercedes, like Red Bulls, those teams that would say probably have their head screwed on the right way when it comes to strategy, by not following them, doesn't it show that they're actually not necessarily thinking in a way that the top team, the teams that we rely on for good strategy, are thinking?
It's a great point. One I hadn't really thought about, but if you think historically, not even too far back last season, so many times the wrong tyres are put on, the hards instead of the mediums, the softs instead of the hards, all that sort of stuff. So maybe the old Ferrari doctrine of inaction, or letting events play out, then ultimately trying to pick up a semblance of a victory or success, and that as you can, is perhaps coming to bear, because, as we say, there was little to no evidence to suggest that Canada would be a two-stop circuit. And actually, you could clearly see from the paddock hoping, praying for a safety car, because when there was one or two incidents of where that could happen, for example, they would pan, they being Sky, where I watched this Grand Prix, they would pan to people, those mechanics, engineers, and those in the Ferrari paddock, desperately holding the tyres, getting ready for the pit stops, hoping this would be the opportunity to execute that double stop. And we're talking here sort of 10 laps after this incident with Logan Sargent happened, not too long, which would make you think that if that were to have happened, if events were to play out differently, they too would have been victim to having to go to a two-stop strategy because of the graining. So I'm inclined to believe that probably yes, you're right there, Tristan, but as with many things in terms of Formula 1, we'll wait to see whether this miracle is a trend or whether this is just a happy anomaly really for Ferrari, and whether the old mistakes and the old ways of laissez-faire, if you will, carry on to bear. And on that existential question, that's all we've got time for in terms of episode 18 of F1 in Review 2023. Thank you very much for listening all the way to the end of this one, be that on your preferred podcast provider or indeed elsewhere. A reminder, you can follow us on Twitter and on TikTok, our handle being F1 in Review, where we post the entire episodes, that on Twitter that is, and short segments of episodes gone by of the most contentious and talkable topics of races and indeed episodes gone by. And so if you're interested in what we thought about prior Grand Prix and the segments between them, do go back and listen, indeed view what we put up there. We'll be back next week as always. Angus will be returning to look forward to the Austrian Grand Prix and to talk about the remaining topics from the Canadian Grand Prix and any news that's come up in the meantime. So thank you very much for listening, and as I say, we'll be back next week.